Hi, I'm June Simon and I'm the 2025 German Brewers Cup champion. I have a company together with my sister, we're Jewel Coffee, and I'm also working for Green Coffee Trader doing quality as I am also a Q Arabica grader. For my championship, I use the dual filters of Sieverist. As you see, they come with 2 brew chambers. And this offers a million ways and a million different approaches on how to use that filter. I think the first idea that usually comes to mind would be using it for blending. But to me, there's also more on how to use that filter. So instead of blending, I thought of the second chamber to be an option to add flavor to my brew. So I actually basically split my brew into 2 parts. And I had one main brew, and then used the other chamber for adding a little extra flavor. How? Well, I had a regular brew in one chamber with a classic 1:15 ratio. And then later, once that first brew was finished, I added a smaller, more concentrated brew to add a portion of flavor. This way, the brew gets a rich juiciness and more intense flavors. So this is a great chance for coffees that come with a rich sweetness already, but are rather low in acidity and are sometimes lacking a bit of flavor, like some of the geishas usually do. So this approach is it's perfect. Why have a filter that comes with 2 chambers and not simply brew 2 coffees and then adding them together after? Well, first thing, you only need 1 dripper for it. So it's easy, you don't have to clean that much, and you don't have to really brew 2 brews. You have everything in one. And then the second option, it's depending on how you use that brew. But for me, as I just want a little side gig, having an extra filter for just 140 milliliter of brew, that would be a little much, right? So this is the perfect chance to have everything in one. Having it in one server, and with this, not losing temperature when mixing it later, but having everything all together in the server right away. So when we first started, the idea was to have 1 main brew and then adding an extra portion of flavor with a smaller second brew that is just extracting the first stage of extraction, where all of the most desirable flavors are often coming from. And in order to have a complete and balanced brew, you need all of the other attributes like bitterness, sweetness, all of that. And by this, usually they cover those precious notes that come first into extraction. And the idea was to have 1 brew in 1 chamber that is complete, and then a second brew, and we tried to have 2 pours for it. So it's a blooming and just 1 pour. And what we discovered was that if we add both ground coffees at the same time and then start brewing in 1 chamber only, the ground coffee of the other chamber attracts the water of the first chamber. And by this, it is a little tricky to control how much water is actually getting in contact with which coffee. So over the time, we developed the idea to just have 1 complete brew in 1 chamber. And after this one is finished, then add the ground coffee of the smaller brew and giving it only 1 good pour of 40 milliliters for my recipe. Also, it was pretty tricky when using both chambers at the same time doing the maths, because you only have 1 dripper and 1 scale. So it's pretty complicated to have a recipe and do the calculation from 1 pour to the next. So to me, I think it's the best option to just have 1 pour, have it finished, and then add for the second one to avoid uncontrolled water contact for the coffee ground. The coffees usually tend to have an over-extracted character, taste-wise. So what we also played around a lot with was the grind size. The first idea was to have a coarser grind size for the main brew, and then adding a concentrate for the second brew with a finer grind size. But this in general led to an over-extracted result. So in the end, we decided to really have the same grind size for both of the coffees, for both of the brews, and by this have a balanced cup. So when it comes to competition, consistency is key, and to have control over what is happening. And the filter itself, I would always recommend to fold it over the edges to have a more stable border between the chambers. But to me, I am a little suspicious, and I always worry a bit, especially when it comes to going to competition. So my idea was to have a ring that is really holding the filter into place. So I reached out to a zebarist and told them about my idea, having some sort of ring that will stick the filter to where it belongs. And we ended up having this nice thing here, 3D printed, also with a nice name over here. And for those who are using the dual filters for, let's say, a regular V60 that comes with a handle, it also has this little spot here to make sure that everything is covered right. It comes with this small outcuts over here for the border. So with this, it really fits perfect and holds the filter into shape, everything where it belongs, with a good tension for the border. So to be fair, the approach of having an extra portion of flavor with this extra brew, it doesn't work with every coffee very well. In my experience, it works very well for coffees that come with a rich sweetness already, but lack in acidity and sometimes flavor. So it works pretty well for a lot of geishas, to be honest. And then also coffees that you would want to have more acidity, a richer juiciness, and more layers of flavor. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for coffees that already come with a high amount of acidity, like, let's say, a washed Kenyan coffee. But to me, it works pretty fine for a lot of naturals and a lot of anaerobic and experimental coffees. As the chambers come with only half the size of a regular chamber, they are perfect for small servings. And also, everyone that loves to bloom with as little water as possible will be super happy. It is very easy and fast to cover all of the coffee ground with these smaller chambers. So, when adding the ground coffee, watch out and pay attention to do it as slow as possible, very controlled, in order to not have any ground coffee around the inner border or around the edges. Then, if you only have ground coffee in one chamber, the chamber will be super stable. The water will basically stick into that chamber only. It's not attracted to the other chamber, only once the second ground coffee is added. When pouring, try to pour as steady and slow as possible. As the chamber is super small, the ground bed, the coffee bed is rising super fast, and we want to avoid having high and dry, which means that the upper particles are without contact to water for too long. This in general leads to a drier aftertaste, and in order to avoid it, try to have the coffee in contact with the water as long as possible. This is also where you can adjust the grind size to. Make it as fine as possible and necessary. And then once the first brew is dripping through, you can gently start adding your ground coffee from the extra brew. And then the good part, you can tare your scale now, so you don't have to do the maths, and gently add water in small motions for the second brew. So let's actually show you the difference between having both coffees in the chambers right from the start, and next to it having one main brew and then adding the ground coffee for the extra one once the brew is finished. Let's start. With having both ground coffees in the chamber. The advantage for this one is actually that you can really have an even distribution of the ground coffee in both chambers right from the start, whilst when you have one main brew already going on and then adding the ground coffee later, I wouldn't necessarily recommend to give a swirl to avoid an uncontrolled extraction for the actual brew. So here we have only the first portion of coffee, and let's start. So for this one, the main idea is to have one brew, right? And see, it is slowly starting to get attracted from the ground coffee in the other chamber. Whilst here, when we add the water, the brew is super stable. Ground coffee and water stay in the chamber where they are supposed to be. This way we have more control over the whole extraction, whilst in this case the contact between ground coffee and water is a little uncontrollable because we never know how much of the water is actually extracted by the ground coffee of the second chamber. So adding the first proper pour after blooming. And in this one here, it really stays in that one chamber. When pouring, try to have a steady pour. Don't pour too fast in order to avoid high and dry. So we don't want to have the coffee bed grow up too fast, having particles stick on the upper part of the dripper for too long without water. This way you would have a drier aftertaste. That's what we call high and dry. So, and then would be here the final pour for our main brew. Same thing here. And now I'm adding the coffee for the extra brew. Do it really gently. And we start here. See, the ground coffee is ready, like kind of pre-wetted. And then adding a small portion for the extra flavors. Whilst here we start with a completely dry, fresh ground coffee. So let's try the two brews and see what the differences are taste-wise. Let's start with the one where we add both ground coffees right before the brewing. All right, cheers. So this brew is a little over-extracted. It's still good, but it has a little drying note, and you can clearly taste that a tiny bit too much has been extracted from the coffee. Let's try the second one. Also aroma-wise, you can already see that it has a richer juiciness. It is more intense with a higher fruitiness. So this coffee is a lot brighter It's not over-extracted, but well-balanced with a rich juiciness and a lot of flavors. Yum.